My name is John Strafford. I was born in September 1942. My parents, Edith and Ernest Strafford, were married in 1937. A year later, my sister Pat was born.
The only photograph I have of my father is his wedding photograph.
On the 22nd of January 1944, he was killed in action and was buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Monte in Italy. I never knew my father. In 1954, I went to the Duke of York's Royal Military School, a boarding school for the sons of soldiers. A tradition of the school was that on parade you wore the badge of your father's regiment. I was the only boy at the school to wear the badge of the York and Lancaster Regiment. I well remember the annual ceremony of trooping the colour, when we marched to the tune of the Duke of York. The only possessions of my father which I have of him are his war medals, which he never saw and never wore, but which truly belonged to him. After the war, my mother married again. My stepfather was a great character and treated me as though I was his only son. I have two stepsisters, Nancy and Jane. My father was an only child, loved dearly by my grandparents.
My grandfather Strafford died in 1949. My grandmother died in 1957. Throughout my life, I never discussed with anyone my father. It was as though he never existed.
In the early evening in November 2010, I was in London passing Westminster Abbey. All the crosses were laid out in the field of remembrance. I thought I would have a look at the plot of the York and Lancaster Regiment. I found the plot, but because it was dark and there were so many wooden crosses, I could not read any names. I had my camera with me, so using its flashlight, I zoomed in on the plot. As I zoomed in, one name, Ernest Strafford, came out and hit me. It was as if he was saying, "I'm here." This was one of the most emotional moments of my life. Tears welled in my eyes and then streamed down my face. For the first time in my life, I thought about my father. I could not help thinking what might have been. What was he like? How different my life might have been if he had lived. I had so many questions to which there was not and could not be any answer. From this moment, my curiosity about my father began to grow. How did he get killed? Perhaps, if I visited his grave in Italy, I might learn more. Even better, perhaps I could visit the battlefield where he died. Over the next 2 years, I tried to find out as much as I could about my father and his family. The Straffords have lived and worked in Sheffield for some 300 years. They were scissor manufacturers,
and in the 1760s had a workshop next to this building in Meadow Street. My ancestors all lived in the same area of Sheffield. My great-grandfather lived in Lancing Road. My father was born in Charlotte Road, and at the time of his marriage lived with my grandparents in Midland Street. On marrying, my parents settled in Hunter Hill Road. It was a 2-up, 2-down house with an attic, and the loo was at the bottom of the garden. During the war, we had an aircraft bomb shelter in the garden. A tin bath was on a hook outside the back door. During an air raid, whilst the blackout was on, our neighbour mistook our front door for the passageway to the back and smashed the glass in the door. For the remainder of the war, the whole was covered in cardboard. My parents were married at St Augustine's Church, and my sister Pat and I were christened there. I went to Hunters Bar Primary School. The headmaster was Thomas Bingham. He was a lovely man, although he did cane me on one occasion when I was late back from lunch. He served with the York and Lancaster Regiment during the First World War. There was a military background in my family. My great-grandfather was one of the longest serving members of the Sheffield Volunteers, which used to meet at the drill hall. My grandfather played the cornet in the band of the 3rd West Riding Brigade. It was only natural, therefore, that my father would volunteer to join the Territorial Army. In 1940, he joined the York and Lancaster Regiment. On my mother's side, 2 of my grandfather's brothers also served in the York and Lancaster Regiment. Sadly, one of them, Maurice Waterfall, was killed in France just before the end of the First World War. My father was a printer's compositor with the Sheffield Telegraph, and after the war his name was shown on their roll of honour. I have looked at the Sheffield archives and been through the war diaries of the regiments that took part in the Battle of Monte Natale. I have spoken to and corresponded with Geoffrey Winter, who is the only survivor of the battle. This is the story of the Battle of Monte Natale. But first, I had to visit the cemetery where my father was buried. Minturno is about 78 kilometres north of Naples, close to the coast. The graves are mainly those of the heavy casualties incurred in crossing the River Garigliano in January. Minturno War Cemetery contains 2,049 Commonwealth graves of the Second World War.
On the 3rd of September 1943, the Allies invaded the Italian mainland, the invasion coinciding with an armistice made with the Italians, who then re-entered the war on the Allied side. Allied objectives were to draw German troops from the Russian front, and more particularly from France, where an offensive was planned for the following year.
Progress through southern Italy was rapid despite stiff resistance, but by the end of October the Allies were facing the German winter defensive position known as the Gustav Line, which stretched from the river Garigliano in the west to the Sangro in the east. After landing at Salerno, the Fifth Army fought its way up the west side of Italy, and by the end of 1943 had reached the general line of the Garigliano River.
Beyond this river stood the western part of the Gustav Line. From this line the Germans had no intention of making a voluntary retreat, for they knew that its loss must mean the fall of Rome. Conversely, if the Allies did not capture Rome, the world would look upon the Italian campaign as a complete failure. Thus, in January 1944, the stage was set for the vital battle for Rome to begin.
In brief, the plan for the attack on the Gustav Line was for the French Corps to attack on the right in the mountain sector, the American Corps to attack Monte Cassino in the central sector, while the British Corps forced a bridgehead over the Garigliano River in the coastal sector on the left. The York and Lanks were on the extreme left of the British Corps front by the sea near Minturno. Then, as soon as these attacks had drawn the enemy's reserves, the American Sixth Corps, including a British division, was to land at Anzio, and by pushing inland from there to threaten the German rear. My father joined the 1st Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment in Italy on the 25th of October 1943. After a spell in the hills and mountains in the centre of Italy, the battalion moved east to the line between Orsogna and Ortona. In December 1943, my father spent his first Christmas abroad. The situation was described by Geoffrey Winter. Rain, snow, slush, deep mud, plus hostile Germans. I was then a 21-year-old infantry platoon commander in a forward position west of Ortona. Things were fairly quiet at the time, and it was decided that each company would be taken out of the line to some farm buildings to the rear, out of enemy view, for Christmas dinner. Our turn came. There were 3 officers in the company, down from the usual 5. Our bedrolls were brought up from the B echelon, so that for one night we would be able to sleep under a roof in comparative comfort. Sitting in our barn that evening, we heard cries for help. Outside there was nothing to be seen, but the cries continued. Then the soldier in distress shouted out his name and his location. It was down a well. Later, it emerged that he had been returning to his overnight shelter after a jolly evening with my platoon, when he encountered a low stone wall, which he had vaulted with ease, only to fall down the well, which was encircled by the wall. Rescue was the problem. No rope was available. However, officers' bedrolls were secured by long leather straps with buckles. These, fastened together, were long enough to reach the shivering soldier, and we managed to haul him out. If he had been well lubricated before his involuntary descent, he was stone cold sober when he was pulled out. The following morning we left and plodded through the slush and mud to our forward positions. For many of the men I knew in the 1st Battalion, the York and Lancaster Regiment, Christmas 1943 was to be their last. On the 9th of January 1944, the York and Lancasters were moved right across to the west in readiness to attack across the river Garigliano and capture enemy positions beyond the town of Minturno. Between Minturno and the sea was a flat coastal plain, semicircular in shape, which was 8 miles across and ran inland for 5 miles. The southwestern edge of the plain was bordered by a range of mountains rising to 2,600 feet, and any movement forward of these mountains came under immediate German observation from the Tremensuoli-Minturno-Tufo ridge, which rose steeply to 500 feet, and, beyond that, Monte at 5,000 feet dominated the area. The Germans had sited their defence according to their usual practice, with outposts on the plain and main defences on the heights at the entrance to the Orsente Valley. The assault up the Orsente Valley was to be in 2 phases. Phase 1 was to be an assault crossing of the river Garigliano on the right by the 13th Infantry Brigade and the 17th Infantry Brigade on the left in order to seize Tremensuoli, Minturno and Tufo. Phase 2 was to be the 201 Guards Brigade and the 15th Infantry Brigade, which consisted of the Green Howards, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry and the York and Lancaster regiments passing through. On the left, the 201 Guards Brigade would push on to the Scari feature, whilst on the right the 15th Infantry Brigade would advance up the Orsente Valley to secure Santa Maria Infante and the Bracchi feature. On the 17th of January, Sherman tanks moved up to battle stations through the blown railway bridge at Mondragradonde. Twisted railway tracks slow their advance. Armour moves up for the battle and mobile priest guns and their crews prepare. Last-minute adjustments and repairs are carried out on the guns, and the gunners eat their eve-of-battle meal. As the sun sets, infantry move up, silhouetted against the sunset. The darkness of the night that follows is abruptly broken by the criss-cross of tracer and gunfire as the attack goes in under cover of darkness. The attack began at 2100 hours on the 17th of January 1944. Heavy shelling of enemy positions preceded the attack by the infantry of the Fifth Army, firing almost continuously for 6 hours. The brigade artillery officer calls out fire orders from his wireless truck to the sailors crouched beside it over their wireless sets, with which they transmit his orders to the destroyers offshore. First light on the river sees casualties being carried up by stretcher bearers. On the narrow bridgehead on the other side, the infantry are held up by mines, and a company of sappers file onto a pontoon raft with detecting apparatus, cast off and slowly cross the river under mortar fire. The enemy is only 200 yards away on the opposite bank. There was a haze of smoke, and through these heavy smoke screens, scout cars move up, passing jeeps acting as ambulances. The infantry press forward through the smoke. During the morning's advance by British troops, some Germans were captured. They were sent back under escort to the brigade headquarters for interrogation. Owing to the difficulty of getting ambulances or any vehicle forward of the Garigliano River, our wounded had to be carried back by hand. As day broke on the 18th of January, the British had secured a shallow bridgehead across the river Garigliano. The bridgehead was subjected to heavy German artillery fire. 17th Infantry Brigade had suffered so many casualties that they were hard-pressed to hold on to the ground that they had secured. At 2200 hours on the 18th of January, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, the York and Lancaster Regiment and the Green Howards crossed the Garigliano River in that order by bridge and boats. Although there were only 6 boats available, most of them having been sunk. A soldier in the York and Lancaster Regiment described the crossing as follows. We crossed the River Garigliano in the early hours in rubber dinghies and could hear the artillery fire, and as it became light we came across some troops digging themselves in. The chap who was carrying our food rations for the section deserted, and it was late evening before we had anything to eat. They told us not to cross into this field as it was full of mines. However, we were told to keep going, and after proceeding about 75 yards, the mines started to go off, and half the platoon were casualties. There were only about 12 of us who escaped, and we were very lucky. We carried on advancing, and prisoners were being taken, and we saw enemy transport retreating. We went into a hut, and a German was sitting on a chair looking quite normal, except a bayonet was sticking into him, and porridge was spilt on the floor. He must have been taken by surprise. We then climbed over a wall into another field, about 8 of us, and in the corner was a German with his hands on a machine gun pointing at us. Luckily for us, and for him, he lifted his hands in surrender. Having crossed the River Garigliano, the York and Lancaster Regiment found that they had no cover at their assembly area, and they were under enemy observation. They suffered a number of casualties, including 4 killed in enemy minefields which had been placed in orchards. Although harassed by accurate enemy artillery fire, the York and Lancs reached the shelter of the hills. By 0100 hours on the 19th of January, D Company of the Wiltshires had reached the east end of Tufo, but enemy tanks were seen on the road to Minturno. The rest of the 19th of January was spent in split trenches in a concentrated area southeast of Tufo, whilst the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry captured the village and the Green Howards captured the town of Minturno. The weather was fine and warm during the day, but cold at night. There were no hot meals, and the blankets and greatcoats had been left on the other side of the river. During the 19th of January, thick smoke could be seen rising from the villages of Minturno and Tufo, caused by shell fire and bombs. German prisoners were brought in on the tank raft, and wounded infantrymen were also brought across the river. Medical supplies and field rations are being sent forward. During this Allied offensive by the Fifth Army, troops successfully established a bridgehead over the Garigliano River at various points. The Germans were, however, still within artillery range of the river, and in consequence movement was likely to bring down shell fire. A pontoon bridge was hit and partially sunk. Some men preferred to run across the bridge and wade through the sunken portion, deeming it wiser to get wet feet. Others preferred to remain dry and crossed by assault boats. At the mouth of the river, troops were ferried across on rafts. This movement was obviously noticed by the enemy, as a considerable number of shells came over. The pontoon bridge further downstream was badly damaged by German mortar fire. Sappers are examining and reconstructing the bridge so that it can be used without delay as a jetty in conjunction with a light tank raft crossing beside the bridge. A bulldozer widens the approaches, and an assortment of vehicles line the road waiting for dark to cross by the reconstructed pontoon bridge. In its retreat towards Rome, the German army did not leave any road or rail bridge intact. The railway spanning the main road and the river Garigliano had to be completely demolished by sappers of the Royal Engineers to free a passage for heavy traffic. Sappers remove the rails suspended in air, while behind them runs the river and a thick smoke screen to hide the bridging operations from German observers in the hills beyond. With the taking of Minturno on January the 20th, hundreds of civilians begin pouring home again. They pass a Sherman tank on its way forward, the demolished bridge and the ever-alert Bofors crew. And one of many Bofors guns guards these operations and the newly won town of Minturno. Engineers, having rapidly constructed the pontoon bridge wrecked by German mortar fire the previous morning, the delayed supplies are now pouring over the river to reinforce the infantry, which have been holding onto the north bank since January the 17th. There are a variety of trucks, brain carriers, armoured cars and gun limbers. A Bofors team followed across the river. A little upstream, the slower but stronger tank raft is putting Sherman tanks on the north bank. On the 20th of January, the York and Lanks were ordered to pass through and capture Monte Natale. The situation at dawn on this day was that the Germans were known to be holding in strength the high ground north of Minturno and a cemetery, as well as Monte Natale, which was another 800 yards further on. The plan for the attack consisted of two phases. In the first, A Company on the right and D Company on the left were to advance behind a barrage along the ridge leading west from Tufo and capture the enemy positions north of Minturno at point 172. In the second phase, D Company was to hold the position captured in phase 1, while B Company on the right and C Company on the left were to follow another barrage and capture Monte Natale at point 156. A Company was to follow B and C Companies and occupy the area of the cemetery. At 0650 hours on the 20th of January, the York and Lanks lined up on the west edge of Tufo for the attack towards Monte Natale. The King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry had captured point 201 in Tufo. In phase 1, the York and Lanks passed through Tufo and crossed the start line behind the barrage on time. After advancing about 800 yards, these two companies attacked the enemy with great dash and determination, and, after a brief fight, the Germans surrendered. D Company took 50 prisoners, although at one point they were held up by barbed wire and suffered 40 casualties. A Company took 100 prisoners. By 0745 hours, the York and Lanks had captured point 172. By 0915 hours on the 20th of January, B Company had passed through A Company's position, and C Company had formed up behind D Company. A soldier from B Company described the attack. We left the long stone wall at Tufo and advanced in open order as best we could for some 500 yards of grapevine wires behind a creeping barrage from our 25-pounders. We came to a clearing where a ginger-haired Jerry was draped over his mortar and must have been caught by the barrage. All the rest of the crew were in an adjacent deep bunker, screaming, "Kamerad!" We fetched them out just as we were strafed by Yank aircraft, so they dived back down the dugout. We left one bloke to take them back to Tufo and carried on. Haversack rations were brought up by jeep, but not so essential, as adequate supplies were available in the enemy positions, including arms and ammunition. Both B Company and the headquarters company were dive-bombed and machine-gunned by our own planes. There was considerable sniping and enemy machine gun fire in B Company's area. In phase 2, when at about 1100 hours the barrage restarted, B and C Companies began their advance against Monte Natale, which lay beyond the Minturno-Santa Maria road. After covering about 400 yards, the companies reached the forward slopes of the hill leading down to the road. At once they came under heavy and accurate fire from enemy tanks in the area of the cemetery and from a group of houses some 800 yards further north. As a result, the attack was temporarily brought to a halt whilst the exact positions of the enemy tanks were ascertained. When two tanks emerged from the cemetery and moved up the road to join the others near the houses, a platoon of the York and Lancs went down the hill and engaged the rear one. Although hit, this tank was not disabled. Artillery fire was then brought down on the area where the tanks were known to be, and this caused them to withdraw some distance towards Santa Maria. At 1400 hours, B Company, which had been bombed and machine gunned and suffered from considerable sniping and enemy machine gun fire, were ordered to withdraw behind D Company. At 1530 hours, B and C companies renewed the advance under heavy artillery support. Thanks to this fire, which paid particular attention to the tanks, the road was crossed without difficulty, and Monte Natale captured against relatively light opposition. The position was then consolidated, with C Company on the exposed northwest end of the feature, B Company on the main part of the feature itself, and A Company astride the road. Behind this line, D Company and Battalion Headquarters occupied the area of the cemetery, whilst on the right, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry took over the hill originally captured by A and D Companies in Phase 1. By 1600 hours, the objective had been achieved. A soldier from B Company describes what happened. We went forward again as the barrage lifted, and topping a rise, came under observation from a jerry tank near the Civvy Cemetery. Our anti-tank crew fired off two bombs at him, one hitting his track guard and the other the turret, without going off. I reckon the second was not primed, but it brought the gun round in a hurry, and he fired on our platoon and caused casualties. Now we were in full sight of the Jerry aid post, where another tank was loading wounded ready to leave the place. In all, 3 Mark III tanks took off at speed past the cemetery. At this time, a Jerry officer and 2 wounded men were captured, and we jumped down a high wall onto the road and into the now empty aid post, leaving the wounded on top of the wall. 2 of us searched right round the aid post and found nothing but dead on stretchers. We searched upstairs and found it clear. Now we waited instructions from company headquarters, but were rudely interrupted by the whirring of a stick grenade, which must have come through the window. It must have been a long fuse, because 7 or 8 of us got outside in a hurry, and the only casualty was the Jerry officer with a hole in his backside the size of a teacup. Then the rest of B Company arrived. A soldier from B Company drew a map of the battle for Monte Natale and described the situation. He said B Company advanced towards Natale and dug in along a ridge which had a high hedge, which was thick enough to be a barrier, but we could still see to our front through the sparse root system. After a while, C Company passed through us and dug in about 50 yards to our front. The whole area became quiet except for digging. All night one could hear the sound of horse transport on the road in front. About 0700 hours on the 21st of January, C Company was subjected to a very heavy enemy counterattack and was driven back with heavy loss onto B Company's position. C Company lost much equipment. There was a failure of communication owing to the failure of the wireless, and very light signals were not seen. No telephone cable was available to the company, as the signals trucks were still south of the river Garigliano, and all cable which could be carried had been used to lay a line to brigade headquarters. Major Webster of B Company
was then ordered to take command of all troops on Monte Natale. He reorganised them as a composite BC company on a 5-platoon basis. Later in the day, about 1500 hours, another enemy counterattack was launched, not only against B and C Company on Monte Natale, but also against A Company on the road. The enemy put down a light smoke screen from the north to hide their attack on A Company. The enemy suffered severe casualties. Accurate defensive fire by the artillery and 3-inch mortars prevented the Germans penetrating the main positions, but some of the forward posts were lost before the counterattack faded at about 19:30 hours. A, B and C companies suffered heavy casualties. D Company was sent up to reinforce A and B companies. The enemy withdrew to the reverse slope. Headquarters was dive-bombed during the day. A hot meal was served at 2100 hours. A soldier from B Company described what happened. Another rude awakening at first light when Jerry put in an attack on C Company. They were quickly overrun as they had been caught having breakfast. Even at 50 yards, you could see our fellows standing with the Jerrys with their hands raised. The Jerrys seemed oblivious to our presence till we picked a couple of them off, but with being so close together, it was hard to shoot at our own. Anyway, they were marched off up the road and Jerry turned his attention to us. They had a good sniper, and Private Cooper's brains were running down the tree at my elbow. His legs must have wedged his body in an upright position while leaning back on the tree behind him. Another 3 shots hit him, and the sniper must have thought that he had missed. Why he didn't shoot me, I can't start to understand, but I soon moved to another position. Then, for the rest of the morning, Jerry came screaming at us in waves. Thank God for the thick hedge and our 25-pounders. The war correspondent of the Sheffield Telegraph wrote an account of the battle. The German forces were vastly superior numerically. At one time they had 5 battalions supported by armour, but the Englishmen only withdrew when ordered to do so. By this time, one company was described as being a skeleton of its former self, but the enemy had paid heavily for his temporary success. When the ground was taken later, hundreds of German bodies were found. In the afternoon, 2 German battalions advanced to attack, but the remnants of the 2 companies held on, aided by heavy artillery support, although the enemy was so close that some shells were bound to fall into British positions. The Germans were at one time within 40 yards of the peak, but there they were halted. One of 12 prisoners said that almost his entire company had been wiped out. Until dark, with ammunition running low, the York and Lancs held off an enemy 6 times as numerous, and at dusk the Germans withdrew to the foot of the hill.
For his able and gallant leadership, Major Webster, who had taken command of all troops on Monte Natale, was awarded an immediate DSO. Captain Wedgbury, who had commanded B and C companies, was awarded the Military Cross.
The citation for Captain Wedgbury's Military Cross reads as follows. On January the 20th, 1944, C Company of the 1st Battalion, the York and Lancaster Regiment, was ordered to attack and capture Natale, point 156, northwest of Minturno. Captain Wedgbury had just that morning taken over command of the company in place of the company commander, who had been seriously wounded. Under his leadership, the company successfully gained its objective. At dawn the following morning, 21st of January, a heavy German counterattack was launched from the west. The company positions were partly overrun and heavy casualties were incurred. Captain Wedgbury successfully resisted this. Also 2 further counterattacks that evening, but the German attacks were broken up and our positions regained. Infiltration by the enemy continued throughout the night, and at 06:30 hours the next day, 22nd of January, the heaviest attacks of all came in supported by tanks. dive bombers and intense artillery concentrations. 22nd of January 1944. This was the day my father was posted missing, believed wounded. Subsequently, it was the date given for his death. At 0530 hours, C Company of the Green Howards arrived on Monte Natale to reinforce the York and Lancaster B, C and D companies. At 0600 hours, a platoon commander in the York and Lancasters was killed by our own artillery fire.
Enemy tank knocked out 2 of our anti-tank guns on the main road and penetrated A Company's position. B Company inflicted heavy casualties on the enemy by using light machine guns, the fire from which was so intense that some guns seized up.
In the morning, at about 7:30 hours on the 22nd of January, the full fury of a really heavy counterattack fell on B and C Company, A Company and the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry on the right. The attack was made by a regiment of the Panzer Grenadiers who had been ordered to reach the line of the River Garigliano at all costs. A Company on the road fought to the last against an overwhelming force of tanks and infantry and was practically annihilated. Major Wilson, its gallant commander, was killed. The company of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry on the immediate right of A Company was also forced back, and the enemy therefore achieved a major penetration of the defences. On Monte Natale itself, B and C companies were fortunate in that they had a regiment of artillery in direct support. By keeping this regiment firing continuously for over 2 hours and by bringing the defensive fire back so that it fell almost on its own positions, the company had now been reinforced by 2 platoons of D Company, kept the enemy off the summit of the hill, but only at the cost of very heavy casualties to itself.
A soldier from D Company described what happened. About 10 of us occupied some ground on a slope, and we dug ourselves in, and the rest of the battalion were dug in different areas. Just above our slope was a road, and over the road down the hill was a cemetery, probably about 200 yards distance from us. We heard a lot of shouting and screaming, and found the Germans had counterattacked one of our platoons, and they had all been taken prisoner or killed. At the time we did not know this, but hearing the screams, as we were not very far away, we guessed something like this was happening. About 10 a.m. I was sharing a trench with a man who also came from Sheffield, and had not been very long with us, when a German tank appeared in front of us a few feet away. We both crouched as low as we could as he sprayed us with bullets, and we both thought it was the end. However, he could not get the barrel of the gun to aim into the trench, and the bullets hit the top and then fell on us. There must have been about 100 rounds. Then it all went quiet, and after about 2 minutes we looked up, and there was no sign of the tank. This must have been a miracle. About 10:30 hours, there was a pause in the enemy counterattack. The composite B, C and D companies, although almost surrounded, still barred the way to Minturno and were prepared to fight on if need be. The enemy were now able to bring fire to bear behind A and B companies' positions, making a counterattack on A company's former position impossible. Later in the morning, enemy tanks advanced down the road, but were held up by our own tanks. Enemy machine guns were established in the houses. Patrols were sent out to stalk the enemy tanks and to deal with their machine guns with some success. After my father died, an officer of the York and Lancs wrote to my mother and told her that they were by a tank which had been hit when another officer was hit. My father went to help him when he in turn was hit. This may well have been the tank that they were next to. By 1300 hours, the Green Howards had occupied a strong position in the rear of Monte Natale, and in consequence the survivors of B, C and D companies were ordered to withdraw. This was successfully done just as a renewed enemy counterattack with tanks from the direction of the road was beginning. By 1630 hours, the York and Lancaster Regiment had withdrawn to east of Minturno to reorganise, and the Green Howards recaptured Point 172. In the space of 2 days, out of approximately 400 men in the York and Lancaster attacking companies, there were about 300 casualties, killed, wounded and missing. Privates Taylor and Cartwright described their experience of the final part of the battle. 6 of us were in a German trench that was so deep we could not see out of it, so we had to crawl out. We were fired at by a tank 300 yards away, and then we saw 4 Germans with a gun coming up the slope. We opened fire with our Bren guns, and they went to ground writhing. When the company got the order to withdraw, we missed it. There was nobody on our right or on our left or behind us. We half expected to find Jerry in our big trench when we went back to it, but it was empty and we sat down. Then we saw a German tank with infantry on it coming up the track to get round behind us, so we decided it was time to go. We backed out of the trench with our Bren and Tommy guns pointing in the direction of the tank and walked backwards until we reached the ridge. Then we turned round and went quick. On the 22nd of January, the same day that the York and Lancaster Regiment was desperately defending Monte Natale, the Americans made an unexpectedly easy landing at Anzio and secured a narrow bridgehead there. As a result of this potential threat to his rear, the enemy, by the 26th of the month, thinned out his troops opposite the British and stopped all his counterattacks against it. Although by no means strong in numbers after its recent heavy fighting, the British 10th Corps seized the opportunity to attack and try to enlarge its own bridgehead over the Garigliano River. Some progress was made, and Monte Natale was retaken on the 29th, 30th of January 1944. On the 30th of January 1944, the 17th Brigade reported that the Northants Regiment had taken Monte Natale. They suffered 30 casualties and took 30 prisoners. There was hand-to-hand fighting. There were 150 Germans on the reverse slopes of Monte Natale, and 60 bodies were recovered. The Coldstream and Grenadier Guards gave support, and the Seaforth Highlanders were in the cemetery area with 2 anti-tank guns and 1 tank in position. 1 tank had been blown up by a mine. Early in February, violent German counterattacks in great strength against the Americans placed the whole Anzio bridgehead in great peril. To relieve the situation, the 56th Division was withdrawn from the Garigliano sector and sent to reinforce the hard-pressed garrison. In consequence, the now sadly depleted British 10th Corps had no option but to stop all its own attacks and stand on the defensive. When therefore the York and Lancaster Regiment returned to the area of Monte Natale, it found it quite quiet. For the last 3 weeks of February, it occupied positions on the hills north and northwest of Minturno. Activity in the area was confined to occasional shelling, patrols and raids to capture prisoners. On the 4th of February, my father's body was recovered and identified by British soldiers, who then buried him. He had served in the army for just 100 days.
On the 1st of March, the York and Lancasters were moved to an area west of Naples, and 3 days later embarked in the evening by boat. Their destination was Anzio, which, after an extremely rough voyage, they reached the next day. So ended the Battle of Monte Natale, a battle no one remembers, and yet it had a dramatic effect on my life. The York and Lancasters had fought its greatest battle of the war, but very few officers and men of the rifle companies reached the concentration area behind Minturno. 48 killed, 144 wounded, and 64 missing tells its own story of the severity of the fighting on and around Monte Natale. Lieutenant Caulfield, who had taken his platoon down the hill and engaged the German tanks, was mentioned in dispatches, as was Private Hinchcliffe. Private Selden was awarded the Military Medal. On the 18th of January 1944, the total complement of the 1st Battalion of the York and Lancaster Regiment was 809 personnel. 1 week later, on the 25th of January, it was 550.
In the battle for Monte Natale, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry suffered 40 casualties killed, 32 missing, and 102 wounded. In the battle for Italy, there were a total of 313,000 casualties. It was not until the 12th of May that Santa Maria Infante was attacked by the Americans. They faced great difficulties, with many anti-tank guns and machine gun nests opposing them. Several Sherman tanks ran onto mines placed along the only access road, but eliminating the town was vital to progress further into the mountains. By the 14th of May, the town, or what was left of it, was taken. On the 18th of May 1944, Monte Cassino was taken by the Polish Lancers. There had been 4 major battles, and the monastery had been reduced to smithereens by bombing and artillery fire. In this last successful battle, the Poles suffered 3,784 casualties, of whom more than a third were killed. Was it worth it? Above all, should one beware of letting this victory of the human spirit persuade one that therefore war is ennobling, and so feed a mood that can only beckon us towards the precipice, for then that victory will have been the hollowest of them all. A short distance from my father's grave are the other graves of members of the York and Lancaster Regiment. I guess they were all comrades in arms. Never again will they hear the march of the York and Lancaster Regiment. My father used to sing the following song to my sister Pat when she was a little girl.
Sunshine, you make me happy when skies are grey. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away.
Only love can make a memory. Only love can make a moment last. You were there, and all the world was young, and all its songs unsung. again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. Keep smiling through, just like you always do.